I'm Madison Quinn, 32, and I built a logistics company from scratch after dropping out of college at 20. For years, I showed up for my dad, holidays, tech help, anything he needed. But when he dismissed my entire career in front of our family, like I'd never done anything worth respect, I made a decision that flipped everything. Ever been overlooked or belittled by someone you kept showing up for? Drop your story in the comments, you're not the only one. Before I dive in, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground after being underestimated, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about taking your power back. What happened next, you wouldn't believe. Growing up, my family had a very specific definition of success. You go to school, get good grades, graduate from a reputable college, get a stable job with benefits, and if you're lucky, maybe, just maybe, you climb your way into middle management. That was the bar. Not high, just fixed. There wasn't room for detours, definitely not for risk, and absolutely not for failure. My father made sure of that. My dad, Richard Quinn, had worked at Lockridge Components since before I was born. He wasn't the CEO or anything, just a reliable presence in the company's operations division. 30 years of steady work, no gaps in employment, no scandals. He wore his tenure like a badge of honor. Same company, same desk, same brand of coffee. Every morning at 6:30, he was out the door with a pressed shirt and a travel mug. Every evening at 6, he was back in his chair with the remote in his hand. He wasn't cruel, exactly, but warmth wasn't in his vocabulary. You didn't get affection, you earned proximity. My older brother Kyle was the golden child by default, not because he was exceptional, but because he followed the blueprint. He graduated from state college with a degree in finance, landed a junior analyst role, and had a wedding with a registry full of stainless steel kitchen appliances. Dad loved that. Stability, predictability, something he could explain to his coworkers in one sentence. Kyle's doing well, just got promoted. Easy. I was different. From the beginning, I asked too many questions. I didn't understand why we had to do things the way they'd always been done. That unsettled my father. My mom tried to buffer us, but she was always caught in the middle. I remember her quietly folding my clothes on my bed when I came home late from high school debate club. "Just try not to challenge him so much," she'd say. "He doesn't know how to meet you where you are." I tried. I got the grades. Straight A's, National Honor Society, full ride to university. I picked business administration because it felt safe. Respectable. I told my dad I was considering a minor in computer science, and he just nodded without looking up from his newspaper. That was the best I ever got, quiet acknowledgement. Things changed my sophomore year when I took an elective in supply chain systems. It lit something up in me. Suddenly, business wasn't just spreadsheets, it was design, efficiency, real-world application. I started thinking about ways to solve inefficiencies in small-scale logistics, how regional vendors could leverage tech without drowning in upfront costs. I joined 2 classmates in developing a platform idea. We worked every night, built a prototype, and launched a beta with one small local client. It didn't pay much, but it worked. That proof of concept gave us the confidence to try for more. By junior year, we had 2 paying clients. It wasn't glamorous, we were crammed into someone's garage with a folding table and a few laptops, but it was real. My co-founders wanted to drop out and pursue it full-time. I was hesitant. I knew what walking away from college would sound like to my father. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized staying would be the concession, not the risk. When I told him, he didn't yell. He just went very still, then said, "So you're throwing your future away for a pipe dream?" He didn't ask questions, didn't want to see the demo or hear the pitch. He just dismissed it out of hand. And when I left school 3 weeks later, he stopped bringing me up in conversation. It was as if I'd been erased from the Quinn family ledger. But I still showed up. Holidays, birthdays, Sunday dinners when I was in town. I helped my mom clean up while my dad watched the news. I sat at the table and answered Kyle's questions about his mortgage even when he acted like my company was a cute side project. When my dad had knee surgery, I was the one who installed the ramp and set up the meal delivery plan. He never said thank you, not once. But when his phone froze or his printer glitched, he'd call me. "Can you come look at this?" No greeting, no endearment, just an ask, and I always came. At the time, I didn't think of it as giving. I thought of it as staying connected. I still wanted that thread intact, even if I was the only one holding on to it. My mom would occasionally say things like, You know he's proud of you in his own way. Or he just doesn't know how to talk about things outside his comfort zone. I believed her because it was easier than admitting I might never hear him say anything kind about what I'd built. My company didn't skyrocket overnight. We grew slowly. We learned through failure. The first time a client threatened to drop us, I thought I'd made a huge mistake, but we pivoted, improved the interface, streamlined the back end. By year 3, we had enough revenue to move out of the garage and into a proper office. By year 5, we were profitable. Not wildly successful, not yet, but stable. Real. I started getting invited to speak on panels, write guest articles for niche industry blogs. Nothing my dad would read, but my LinkedIn inbox was busy. I mentioned it once casually over dinner. We just signed with a mid-sized distributor. Their CEO liked our proposal. My dad didn't look up from his plate. They'll drop you the minute something cheaper comes along. I should have let it go, but I didn't. We're not the cheapest. That's kind of the point. He scoffed. Then you'll fail even faster. No one pays extra for risk. My mom gently tapped his arm. Richard, but he was already done with the conversation. In his mind, I was a dropout trying to pass herself off as a professional. He had already written the end of my story, and it wasn't a happy one. I didn't argue with him after that. I just kept working, quietly, steadily, under his radar, until the day I got an email from Lockridge's corporate board. A consulting firm I'd worked with had recommended me for a major advisory role during their restructuring phase. The position? Independent board chair. For a 1-year term, with full authority to oversee operational changes and approve budgetary shifts. The company, Lockridge Components. My father's company. The same place he'd worked for 3 decades. The same board whose CEO I'd briefly met 2 years prior, during a conference my dad didn't know I'd spoken at. The irony was sharp, but I didn't laugh. I just said yes. Because whatever came next wasn't about revenge. It was about walking into a room I'd already earned a place in, even if no one in my family had noticed me walking that path at all. By the time I turned 27, I had exited my first company with a respectable acquisition and equity that didn't just pad my bank account, it gave me options. I reinvested in 2 small startups that aligned with my interests and quietly built a name for myself in operational consulting. I wasn't flashy. I didn't post revenue milestones on Instagram or pose with luxury cars. I just did good work and stayed in motion. My dad never asked about any of it. In his mind, I was still trying things out. He'd use that phrase at family gatherings, always with a half smile and a sideways glance that told everyone in the room he didn't take me seriously. Madison's doing her little tech experiments, he once said to a cousin who asked about my work. She's always been creative. That word, creative, was his polite substitute for unstructured, unserious, unstable. At the same dinner, he spent 10 full minutes talking about my sister's MBA program. Emily had gone back to school after working in HR for 5 years, and Dad spoke about it like she was splitting atoms. Top of her class, he beamed, nodding at the table. Real leadership potential. I offered a brief congratulations, and Emily smiled graciously, but the conversation moved on without me. No one asked what I was working on. No one asked where I'd flown in from or how the acquisition had gone. I might as well have been the plus one to my own family. That's when I started to notice it. The shift. My dad wasn't just indifferent, he was uncomfortable. The more successful I became, the more tension seemed to follow. It wasn't open hostility. It was more subtle. A tightness in his shoulders when I mentioned work. A sudden change of topic when I used language he didn't understand. I think part of him knew I had passed him in some invisible race he thought I'd dropped out of. But rather than acknowledge it, he reframed the narrative to suit his comfort. I hadn't succeeded, I'd gotten lucky. Or worse, I was just bluffing and hadn't been caught yet. During one of our rare one-on-one lunches, I mentioned a recent consulting project. It's a national distributor. They're running a warehouse network with pre-Y2K software. I'm helping them modernize without gutting their budget. He didn't look up from his sandwich. Sounds like a lot of jargon to justify freelancing. I let the comment pass, not because it didn't sting, but because I knew it wouldn't matter. I could show him financials, client testimonials, feature articles, he'd still see me as someone who hadn't done it the right way. No degree, no corporate title, no gold-plated resume. At another dinner, I offered, carefully, to connect him with a tech team I knew. Lockridge's internal systems were outdated, and I'd heard through a colleague that they were hemorrhaging money on freight costs. I framed it diplomatically. There's a group I trust who could probably save your team a lot of time and money. They specialize in legacy systems and... He cut me off with a quick laugh. We don't need advice from someone who didn't finish school. He said it with a grin, like it was a harmless joke. The room went quiet for a beat too long, and my mom reached for her wine glass without saying anything. I didn't argue, I just nodded and changed the subject. But inside, something went flat. He wasn't just dismissing my input, he was doing it in front of people, making a point. I noticed it more after that. Small digs slipped into casual conversation. In my day, we didn't quit college when things got hard. Emily says some of her professors are worried about AI replacing real professionals. A real job comes with a W-2, not a brand strategy. He never looked at me directly when he said these things. They were dropped like stray pennies on the floor, easy to overlook, but still meant to be picked up. My mother, bless her, tried to mediate. She once pulled me aside after a cookout and said, "He just doesn't understand your world, Nat. It's not personal." But it was, or at least it felt personal. I started limiting the information I shared with him. I'd skip details about travel, keep client names vague, avoid bringing up money. The less he knew, the fewer chances he had to downplay it. That became our silent agreement. I wouldn't ask for respect, and he wouldn't be forced to give it. But one afternoon, we broke that truce. Emily was visiting from grad school, and my parents had everyone over for dinner. During dessert, the topic of Lockridge came up, something about changes in upper management. I asked if the company was considering reworking their logistics. He said no. Then, before I could respond, he added, "Even if we were, I wouldn't bring in anyone who gets their business advice from YouTube." There was no laughter, just silence. My mom muttered something about clearing the plates, but the moment had already landed. I looked at him and said quietly, "I've built and sold a company. I consult for firms bigger than Lockridge. That's not YouTube. That's work." He shrugged. "Sure, but you don't have credentials. That kind of thing matters when real money's on the line." And that was the moment it clicked. He wasn't just skeptical. He was ashamed. Of me, not because I'd failed, but because I'd succeeded without the roadmap he trusted. I had taken a path he couldn't follow, and rather than admit he didn't understand it, he decided to discredit it. To discredit me. The rest of the evening passed with forced small talk and early departures. Emily offered me a ride back to my place, and as we pulled away, she said, "You know he reads everything you post online, right? He just pretends not to." I didn't answer. I wasn't sure if it made things better or worse. In the weeks that followed, I noticed he stopped returning my calls. Not every time, but often enough to create distance. When I visited, he'd stay busy, fixing something in the garage, taking long walks during family meals. My mom filled the space with updates about his cholesterol and how the garden was doing, but I could feel the detachment growing. He didn't want to talk to me because he didn't know how to see me anymore. That would have been the end of it, a slow, quiet unraveling. But then I got a call from a firm in Chicago. Lockridge's board was initiating a full operational overhaul. They wanted outside guidance. My name had come up more than once. I didn't know at the time who had floated it, one of the executives I'd worked with years ago, maybe. What I did know was that this wasn't a small project. It was structural, strategic, and it needed someone who could see the company from the outside and steer it toward something better. They asked if I'd consider serving as the interim chair of the board for the upcoming fiscal year. I said yes. I wasn't thinking about my dad when I accepted. Not really. I was thinking about what the job required and whether I could do it well. But somewhere, buried under all the professionalism and logic, I also knew this would be the moment everything shifted. Because this time, he wouldn't get to pretend I was invisible. This time, I'd be standing at the front of the room, and he'd have to see me. It was a Sunday evening in late spring, one of those forced family dinners my mom liked to host whenever my sister was in town. She'd invite half the cousins, an uncle or two, and anyone else within a 40-minute drive who still answered her group texts. My dad never really cared who showed up as long as someone brought the wine, and the house was quiet again by 9. I had flown in from New York that morning and gone straight to the gathering from the airport. No time to decompress or change, just dropped my bag at the door and went into autopilot. Smile, hug, small talk. I was used to it by now. I didn't expect anyone to ask real questions, and most didn't. Dinner was served buffet style, paper napkins and aluminum trays. Emily was describing some panel she'd moderated at her grad school, something about emerging leadership strategies. Dad sat at the head of the table, nodding occasionally, clearly proud. She was the only one who got his full attention anymore. One of our cousins, Ben, maybe, asked what I was working on these days. Nothing dramatic, just a casual question as he passed the rolls. I opened my mouth to answer, already prepared to keep it vague, but I didn't get the chance. My dad leaned back in his chair, gesturing with his fork. "She's still bouncing around," he said, smiling like it was some family joke. "Trying to figure it out. Not everyone's built for stability." There was a pause, not long, but just enough for my jaw to tighten. I laughed lightly, trying to steer things back toward neutral. "Actually, we just closed a partnership with a mid-market distributor, East Coast Logistics. Pretty big deal." He didn't even look at me. "It's fine," he said, already reaching for his drink. "Not everyone needs a real job, some people just float." No one responded. Even Emily blinked like she'd just heard something she wasn't sure how to process. A few people glanced down at their plates. My mom busied herself stacking used salad bowls. I excused myself. No drama, no tears. Just stood up, walked through the living room, and let the door shut behind me. Outside, I stood on the curb, arms crossed, watching the tail lights of passing cars blur under the porch lights. It wasn't just what he said. It was the way he said it. So easy. Like my entire adult life had been a placeholder for something more respectable I never managed to achieve. I knew what he meant by real job. He meant titles, office buildings, pay stubs printed on corporate letterhead, not signing my own checks or choosing which projects to take on. He meant structure, but only the kind he recognized. I could have had 10 times his salary and it wouldn't have mattered. I hadn't done it his way, so in his mind, I hadn't done it right. When I came back inside, no one looked at me. The table had moved on to a new topic: tax season, someone's dog surgery. I sat down next to Emily, who leaned over and whispered, "You okay?" I nodded. It was a lie, but a polite one. After dinner, my mom handed me a container of leftovers and asked if I wanted to come by for coffee the next morning before I flew out. I told her I'd see how the day went. Dad was in the kitchen arguing with the dishwasher and barely registered me leaving. I spent that night in a quiet hotel near the airport, ordered chamomile tea from room service, and opened my laptop to check in on a few client dashboards. All of them were performing above target. The irony wasn't lost on me. That moment, the dinner, the comment, the way the whole room folded around his words like they were expected, it stayed with me. Not because it was new, but because it was final. He wasn't going to change. He wasn't even trying. He needed me to be small. That was the part I couldn't let go of. He needed me to still be drifting so he could stay anchored. My success threatened the logic he'd used to navigate his entire adult life. And instead of expanding his view, he clipped mine down to something more manageable. What he didn't know, what no one at that table knew, was that I'd already signed the paperwork. That same week, I'd been offered the board chair position at Lockridge, the company he'd served for 30-plus years without ever stepping a toe into executive leadership. They wanted someone external, someone with a clean slate and a systems-focused lens. My name came up 3 times in their search. I was their first choice. When I accepted, I kept it quiet. The onboarding process would take a few weeks. The formal announcement would be made at the next board meeting during a closed session. My dad was on the invite list. I didn't plan anything. I didn't script a moment or fantasize about some grand reckoning, but I also didn't back away from it. For once, I was going to walk into a room where my presence couldn't be dismissed or reframed, where no one could cut me off mid-sentence and make it feel like nothing. That week moved fast. Conference calls, NDAs, logistics assessments. I kept my head down and did the work. But under the surface, something had shifted. A quiet, stubborn part of me that had always hoped for recognition, just a sliver of respect, finally let go. I wasn't trying to win him over anymore. I was done asking to be seen. And whether he liked it or not, the next time we crossed paths professionally, he'd have no choice. because the next time I walked into a room he was in, I wouldn't be his daughter. I'd be his boss's boss. That night, I called Adam, my co-founder. We started the logistics platform together in that drafty garage 6 years earlier, when we were both living on black coffee and second-hand monitors. These days, we weren't in the trenches like we used to be, but we still talked regularly. Not just about work, about everything. He picked up on the second ring. Back in town. Just for the weekend, I said. I didn't even try to mask how tired I sounded. Had dinner with my family tonight. He said, that bad. There was a long pause before I answered. Worse than usual. I told him what happened. Not the whole dinner, just the part that mattered. My dad's comment, the silence that followed. The way it settled into the room like dust that no one wanted to disturb. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just said it plainly, like I was giving a status update on something mildly disappointing. When I finished, Adam was quiet for a while. I could hear him shifting on the other end of the line, probably at his desk, still surrounded by notes and whiteboards. Then he said, "You know we've been talking to their board, right?" I blinked. Lockridge. "Yeah," he said. "Their CEO's been looking at a full restructure. Operations are a mess. They've got overlapping vendor contracts, outdated routing software, warehouse redundancies. It's like a museum of poor decision-making. They reached out about a month ago. Quietly." I sat down on the edge of the hotel bed, trying to keep my voice neutral. I didn't know they were that close to moving. They are, and they want someone external to chair the board during the transition. A fixer. Someone with credibility who understands legacy systems but won't protect dead weight. I didn't say anything. "They asked about you," he added. I kept staring at the floor. The hotel carpet was cheap, beige, overly patterned, like someone had tried to make it look more expensive than it was. "I told them you'd be perfect for it," Adam continued, "because you would be." I took a breath. They know I'm his daughter. They do now, and they still want you. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. It was one of those rare moments where the past and the present folded over each other like layers of paper. My dad's voice from dinner still echoed in my ears. Not everyone needs a real job. Some people just float. And now I was being asked to lead the board of the company he'd devoted 3 decades to. Not as a favor, not as a PR stunt, but because I was the right fit. I thought about the younger version of myself, sitting at the dining room table trying to explain a prototype to my parents while they asked how long I could keep playing startup. I thought about all the family events where my work was treated like a hobby, the way no one ever asked what I actually did. I thought about every time I'd excused his comments, told myself he didn't mean it, that he just didn't know better. I gave him so many passes I stopped keeping track. This wasn't about revenge, not even about vindication. It was about being done. Done shrinking. Done pretending his opinion was the final word on my worth. I accepted the role the next morning. The official onboarding process was clean and quiet. I'd already worked with most of the consultants being brought in, and my name carried enough weight in the operations space that the board had no hesitation. The CEO, Martin Langford, was sharp, strategic, the kind of person who actually listened. We had a long conversation about expectations, timelines, areas of resistance. He didn't ask about my father once. That told me everything I needed to know. Over the next few weeks, I split my time between existing client obligations and prepping for the transition at Lockridge. I reviewed every available report on the company's infrastructure. It was worse than I thought. The inefficiencies were systemic, entire departments running on spreadsheets and hope, managers duplicating work across platforms, no centralized strategy for vendor management. My dad's department wasn't the worst, but it was part of the problem. Too comfortable, too slow to adapt, too loyal to legacy systems because they felt safer than admitting something needed to change. I didn't make excuses for him. I didn't flag his name or move his reports to the top of the stack. I treated his division like all the others. I didn't owe him protection. Not in this room. Not anymore. Still, I didn't talk about it much. Only a few people close to me even knew. Adam, of course, my lawyer. My sister eventually, though that was a shorter conversation than I expected. Emily just nodded, like she'd seen this coming for years. "He's not going to take it well," she said. I'm not giving him the option, I replied. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. My first official appearance would be at the top of the agenda. Martin planned to introduce me, followed by a brief statement from me about the direction we'd be heading. No dramatic overhaul, just calm, intentional change. I had no interest in walking in like a storm. But I also wasn't planning to apologize for the rain. The Friday before the meeting, I got a call from my mom. She wanted to know if I'd be around that weekend. She was making a roast. My dad had invited a few old coworkers over for poker night, nothing fancy. I told her I had a work trip coming up, left it at that. There was a pause, then she said, "He's been different lately, not bad, just quieter." I didn't know what to say, so I said, "Yeah, well, a lot's changing." She hesitated again. "Are you sure you don't want to come by?" I said no, gently but firmly. That weekend, I stayed in the city, finalized the presentation, took long walks and tried not to overthink what Monday would look like. I kept replaying that dinner, the way he dismissed me without flinching, the way no one challenged him, the ease with which I let it happen again. But this time, I wasn't walking away from the table. This time, I'd be sitting at the head of it. The corporate offices at Lockridge sat in a sprawling glass and steel building on the north end of the city, just off the interstate. I'd driven past it dozens of times growing up, watching the seasonal banners change outside as the company rolled out new partnerships or celebrated end-of-quarter wins. I used to imagine my dad walking confidently through those automatic doors in his pressed shirt and faded name badge, making his rounds and clocking his hours with quiet pride. It had been his world for 32 years, a world I was never supposed to enter. But on Monday morning, I walked through those same doors, this time, with my name already printed on the building's internal boardroom itinerary. Security handed me a temporary badge with my full name and new title. I tucked it into the front of my blazer and made my way toward the elevators. The receptionist smiled, offered a quiet good morning, and directed me to the executive floor. Martin met me outside the conference room, coffee in hand, tie slightly crooked. "They're just wrapping up Q2 numbers," he said under his breath. "You'll go in right after. I'll introduce you." I nodded. "How's the room?" "Quiet, tense." He glanced toward the frosted glass. "They know something's coming, they just don't know what." "Perfect." He laughed lightly, then straightened his jacket. "You ready?" "Very." He pushed open the door and stepped inside, his voice carrying in a calm, even tone. "Thank you all for your patience. Before we close out today's agenda, I want to introduce someone who will be instrumental in guiding our restructuring process." There was a subtle shift in the room, papers rustling, chairs adjusting, the low murmur of curiosity. I stood just beyond the doorway, waiting. Martin continued. "This is someone with an exceptional track record in logistics innovation and strategic reform. She'll be working closely with the board and leadership team during this next phase. Please welcome our new board chair, Madison Quinn." I stepped into the room. There was a brief moment of quiet, too quiet, and then the clink of a coffee mug slipping from someone's hand. My dad. The ceramic shattered against the edge of the conference table and spilled across the polished floor. His face was drained of color, eyes fixed on me like he couldn't reconcile what he was seeing. I didn't break eye contact. "Hi, Dad," I said, calm and steady. Martin cleared his throat. "Let's take 5 while facilities handles this," he said, nodding to the assistant by the door. "We'll reconvene with next steps in a moment." I didn't stay to watch him gather the pieces. I turned and walked out with Martin, who offered me a subtle nod of approval as the door shut behind us. The rest of the morning moved fast. I met with key department heads, was briefed on initial audit findings, and introduced to the new consulting liaison team. Everyone was professional, respectful, even if they were shocked by my age or background, they didn't show it. The weight of the title did its job. I was Madison the Dropout. I was Madison the board chair, a fact that seemed to sit uneasily in the air, particularly for one person. Later that afternoon, as I was reviewing project timelines outside one of the smaller conference rooms, I heard the footsteps before I saw him. My dad stopped a few feet away, arms crossed tightly across his chest. "You blindsided me," he said, keeping his voice low but pointed. I looked up from the folder I was holding. "No," I said, "you just never looked." His jaw clenched. "You knew I worked here, you could have said something." "I didn't think you'd be interested," I replied. "Every time I brought up my work, you tuned it out. I figured I'd save us both the trouble." He took a step closer, voice still tight. "You came in through the back door. Politics. Optics. Someone needed a name, and you happened to be available." I closed the folder slowly and met his eyes. "That's not what happened. They chose me because I know how to fix what's broken. That includes this place. That includes your department." His mouth opened slightly, like he wanted to say something else, something worse, but then stopped himself. "You're not qualified to lead a company like this," he said instead. "Not with your background." I nodded. "You're right, I don't have a traditional background, but I built a company from nothing. I've consulted on 3 major restructures in the last 2 years, and I'm not here for approval. I'm here for results." He didn't respond. Just stood there, like the foundation of something he'd relied on was starting to shift beneath him. "I don't want this to be personal," I added. "But if you can't separate that from your work, you might need to think about what comes next for you." For a second, something flickered across his face, something that almost resembled fear. Not of me, but of irrelevance. He didn't follow me when I walked away. The next few days were quiet. He didn't call, didn't text. My mom sent a vague message about how work must be keeping everyone busy, followed by a picture of her tomato plants. I didn't respond. Inside the company, things began to move. My team conducted a thorough review of all operating units. We sat down with mid-level managers and field supervisors. We didn't cut for show, we cut where it mattered. We rewrote supplier contracts, merged redundant processes, and outlined an updated logistics protocol that would phase in over the next 2 quarters. My dad's name came up once in a strategy session. His department was underperforming in 3 key areas. I didn't comment. The data spoke for itself. A week later, his division was flagged for restructuring. He wasn't fired. He wasn't demoted. But 2 key reports were moved to a different branch. He lost control of his preferred software system and was told to collaborate with one of the external vendors I'd brought in. I wasn't in the room when he got the news, but I heard he took it quietly. The fallout didn't come in the form of yelling or grand gestures. It came in smaller ways, memos where his name was no longer listed as point of contact, meetings he used to lead getting reassigned. I didn't engineer it. I didn't block it. I just let the process work. The consequences weren't just his, they were the company's. Years of doing things the old way had caught up to them, and now they needed something different. My being here was just the symptom. The cause was years of resistance to change. At home, things were tense but polite. I didn't go out of my way to call or visit, and no one asked why. Emily texted occasionally, checking in, mostly with updates about school or articles she thought I'd find interesting. She never brought up the company. Neither did I. One evening, about 3 weeks after the board meeting, I got a text from Adam. "How'd it feel?" I stared at the screen for a long time before typing back. Like walking into a house I wasn't invited to, then realizing I owned the deed. He didn't respond right away. When he did, it was just one word. "Good." I put the phone down and looked around my apartment. Quiet, clean, a view of the skyline through the window. Not the biggest place, not the flashiest, but mine. I had spent so many years trying to earn space at someone else's table. I didn't realize I'd been building my own the whole time. The changes didn't happen overnight. They couldn't. Lockridge was a legacy company, thick with decades of inertia. Every system we touched exposed another layer of resistance, people who'd built their identities around outdated processes, teams protecting silos like territory, managers who spent more time defending status quo than asking whether it still made sense. But the board backed me, and Martin never wavered. That helped. For months, I met with division heads, reviewed infrastructure maps, and worked through layers of data that hadn't been properly audited in years. We didn't just optimize, we overhauled. Some systems were gutted entirely. Others were restructured piece by piece. It wasn't just about cutting costs, it was about building something sustainable. My dad's division was flagged early. Not because I pointed fingers. I didn't have to. The numbers did the work for me. They had redundancies across functions, inconsistent reporting lines, and a top-heavy leadership chart that didn't align with actual output. We weren't looking to punish people. We were looking to get lean, to move faster, and to survive in a space that was evolving faster than they were. His department didn't survive untouched. Titles were realigned. 2 mid-managers were reassigned to different divisions. Software that had been patched and repatched was replaced with an integrated system that required retraining, and the team that used to report directly to him split in half and moved under 2 newer leads. He wasn't demoted, not formally, but his role was smaller now, sharper, less protected, less insulated by routine. I watched all of it unfold from a deliberate distance, not because I didn't care, but because proximity would have muddied the waters. I made a point of being present without interfering. I never pushed, never made it personal. I didn't need to. He got the message. At first, he stayed quiet, showed up, did his work, kept his head down. I'd see his name occasionally on weekly reports or copied in a reply chain. Nothing remarkable, just enough to show he was still trying to hold his place. But then something shifted. I started hearing things from other managers. That he'd been asking junior staff for input. That he'd begun showing up early to help with cross-department meetings. That he'd sat through 2 hours of onboarding with the new software team without complaint. It wasn't a full transformation, not yet, but it was something, a kind of adjustment. The beginning of a man trying to rebuild himself inside a structure he no longer controlled. A few weeks into Q3, I ran into him in the hallway outside the second-floor project room. He was carrying a stack of reports and looked tired, but not beaten. Just tired in the way people look when they've started doing work they didn't expect to have to learn this late in the game. We nodded at each other, that was it. No speech, no confrontation, just a silent acknowledgement that the ground had shifted and he was still trying to stay upright. I think I respected him more in that moment than I ever had growing up. Not because he was strong, but because, for once, he was quiet enough to learn. The consultants I brought in started referring to him as low-key reliable. It wasn't praise, exactly, but it was a far cry from the caution flags I'd seen in the first wave of evaluations. He wasn't leading change, but he wasn't standing in the way anymore either. Sometimes that was enough. My mom called occasionally during this stretch, usually in the evenings when she knew I'd be winding down. She never asked directly about the company, but she'd mention things, that my dad had started coming home later, that he'd asked for a few books on systems management, that he'd cleared out a drawer in the garage to build a workspace. She wasn't fishing. She was offering little glimpses, letting me know that even if the relationship hadn't changed, maybe the man had started to. I didn't say much in response. I didn't know what to say. It felt too early to draw conclusions, and I didn't want to assign growth to him just because the optics had shifted. I'd seen him retreat before, seen him armor up. I wanted to see what would happen when the pressure didn't let up right away. So I kept doing the work. We rolled out new metrics for performance tracking, launched a pilot program for warehouse optimization, hired a VP of transformation strategy, someone with real authority and a mandate to disrupt what wasn't working. More roles were shuffled, more departments merged. Some people left, others adapted. And through it all, I watched my dad stay. Quietly, deliberately, he stopped fighting the current and started swimming with it. He wasn't particularly friendly. We never had coffee, never shared a private conversation, but we moved through the same spaces now, and the air between us didn't feel loaded anymore. It just felt neutral, professional, like 2 people doing a job in the same building. There was one moment mid-fall when I caught him standing outside the break room with a younger analyst, someone new. He was pointing something out on a tablet, explaining a process. His tone was calm, focused. The analyst nodded, asked a follow-up. My dad smiled, not forced, not performative. I walked past without stopping, but I clocked it. The tone, the posture, the shift. That night, Adam texted me a news alert. One of our Lockridge initiatives had been picked up in a trade publication. A clean, well-written piece about transformation at scale. It mentioned the board, the leadership team, and quoted me twice. My dad didn't say anything about it. But I noticed a printed copy of the article folded neatly on the corner of his desk the next time I passed his office. He never asked for credit, and I never needed him to. The company was changing, and so was he in ways I hadn't expected. It didn't mean we were healing. It didn't mean I forgave him. But it meant something was shifting. Not in a loud, dramatic way. Just in the quiet decisions people make when no one's watching. When they realize the world's moving forward, with or without them, and decide they want to keep up. It was a Thursday. Late. Most of the building had cleared out, and the only sounds left were the low hum of the HVAC and the occasional clink of a vending machine cycling change. I'd stayed behind to prep materials for the next morning's review, a logistics audit presentation that was already sitting heavy in my head. I was halfway through organizing slides when I heard the knock. It was soft, hesitant, not the kind of knock that comes from someone used to barging in. I looked up, expecting a custodian or maybe one of the junior consultants needing something last minute. Instead, it was him. My dad stood in the doorway of my temporary office, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. I leaned back slightly in my chair. "Hey." "Hey," he said, then a pause. "Got a minute?" I gestured to the seat across from me. He closed the door quietly behind him and sat down without rushing. He looked tired, not in a dramatic way, just worn around the edges. His shirt was wrinkled from the day, sleeves rolled, collar undone. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen him like that. Vulnerable, human. He didn't start right away, just looked around the office like he was taking inventory of the space. Then finally, he said, "I didn't expect you to be the one leading us." I let the silence hang between us. It wasn't a question, it didn't need a reaction. After a few seconds, I said, "That's the thing, you never expected much from me." He nodded slowly. I was wrong. No apology, not directly, but that was as close as he was probably capable of getting, and it landed harder than I thought it would, not because it fixed anything, but because it was true. He sat back in the chair. I always thought success looked a certain way: safe job, clear path, promotions, pensions, plaques. I thought you failed because you walked away from all that. I didn't say anything, just let him talk. "But you didn't walk away," he said. "You built something else, something I didn't recognize." His voice stayed low, measured. No theatrics, just a man sitting with the weight of his own assumptions. "I didn't understand what you were doing, and instead of asking, I made it small. That was easier, for me." That one I felt deeply. I watched him for a long moment, then said, "I didn't need you to understand everything. I just needed you to believe I could handle it." He nodded again. "I know." It wasn't an apology in the traditional sense, but I wasn't looking for perfect wording. I was looking for acknowledgement. For the first time, I got it. We didn't hug. That would have felt forced, like jumping over a decade of complicated history in one gesture. But we didn't need that. We just needed this. Two people sitting in a room, seeing each other clearly for once. He stood after a few minutes, offered a quiet good night, and let himself out. The next week, I saw him in a team meeting I was observing from the back of the room. It was a small group, 6 people, mostly operations staff, and he was walking them through a systems update related to one of our new vendor integrations. At the end, he paused, then said, "This new process is thanks to some changes initiated by our board leadership. Madison's been leading that effort." He didn't say it with fanfare. He didn't overdo it. But there was a note in his voice, something that sounded like respect or maybe recognition. The team turned, a few nodded in my direction, and we moved on. Later that day, a junior associate told me he'd asked for their feedback on the new training protocols, that he'd actually listened, adjusted timelines to make it easier for field staff. None of that had happened 6 months ago. I didn't let it change everything overnight. I didn't start showing up at Sunday dinners or calling for no reason. There was still distance, still caution. We built that space for years, and it would take more than one conversation to collapse it. But I did stop dreading running into him in the hallway. And when I passed his office and saw the familiar folder system he'd used for decades being replaced by one of our updated platforms, I smiled to myself. Not because it meant he'd changed completely, but because it meant he was trying, not to please me, not to erase the past, but to meet the future head-on instead of dragging his heels. Emily noticed too. She called me one night after a check-in with Mom. "He's different," she said. "Not soft, but quieter, like something cracked open." I didn't confirm or deny it, just let the thought settle. Later that month, at a broader company strategy session, he stood during the Q&A portion and asked a question about integration timelines. It wasn't an easy question. It was the kind of thing that required nuance and foresight. And when I answered it, he listened, took notes, nodded once. That was the first time I allowed myself to feel it. Trust not rebuilt but re-entered. Not all at once, not as some grand reconciliation, but as a slow shift. We weren't healed, but we were facing in the same direction now. And for once, that felt like enough. It's been 2 years. The work at Lockridge wrapped after 18 months. The systems held. The new leadership team took over. I stepped down from the board after delivering my final quarterly report with recommendations on growth strategy and operational risk mitigation. No drama, no farewell speeches, just a clean transition. I took a month off after that. First real break in years. No email, no airports. I stayed in a small place near the water and read books that had nothing to do with logistics, transformation, or board governance. I cooked simple meals, slept 8 hours a night, forgot what day of the week it was. When I got back, things had shifted again, quietly, the way real progress does. I wasn't chasing anything anymore. Not validation, not a title, not even a challenge. I'd already proven to myself what I could build, what I could fix, what I could lead. Now I was focused on who I could support. I started mentoring younger founders. Not in a formal program, just people who found me through word of mouth, asked for a coffee, and showed up with questions. Some were brilliant, some were overwhelmed, most were both. I saw pieces of myself in them, the energy, the uncertainty, the instinct to prove instead of ask. I told them what no one told me early on, that it's okay to not have a pedigree, that your ideas are valid even if your resume is short, that the room will listen if you don't flinch when you speak. They listened. Some of them went on to launch great things. Others found what they really wanted was different altogether. That mattered too. I still consult occasionally, selectively. I don't do the grind anymore. I don't need to. I choose the projects that feel aligned, that solve real problems, that don't drain the life out of everyone involved just to deliver a 0.5% bump in quarterly returns. One of those projects led me to a nonprofit infrastructure group trying to optimize food distribution across underserved regions. It's not glamorous work, no big payouts, but the impact is measurable and the team is sharp. I like being there. I like what it reminds me about scale and purpose. As for my dad, we talk. Not every week, but consistently enough that it no longer feels strange. Our conversations are different now. Lighter, mutually respectful. He'll call sometimes with a question about a tool he's trying to learn or to ask if I've read something in the journal. I usually have. Sometimes we talk about operations, but more often it's about small things. His bike route, my mom's new garden project, a recipe he tried and failed to replicate. There are still limits. I don't overshare. He doesn't dig. That boundary stays intact, and it's better that way. We've both learned how far not to go. But the sharp edges are gone. There was one conversation last fall that stuck with me. We were at a small family gathering, nothing formal, just barbecue in the backyard, folding chairs on the patio. He sat beside me, watching my niece chase bubbles across the lawn. After a while, he said, "You ever miss it, Lockridge?" I shrugged. Not really. I liked the challenge, but I never meant to stay. He nodded slowly. "They still talk about what you did there." I smiled just barely. "Good or bad?" "Mostly good," he said. Then, after a pause, "They were wrong to overlook you." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. That acknowledgement wasn't just for Lockridge, and we both knew it. I've stopped needing him to say more than that. The truth is, I don't measure success the way I used to. I don't need it to look like revenge or redemption. I'm not trying to balance a ledger anymore. Some people come around late. Some never do. That doesn't change what you build while they're busy looking away. For a long time, I tried to earn space at a table I thought mattered. Now I understand that the most valuable people in the room are often the ones you never noticed at first, the ones who weren't loud, who didn't lead with a resume, who just kept showing up with results and a steady hand. I was that person for years. Now I try to find them in every room I enter. The overlooked, the underestimated, the ones with no degree but a sharp eye, the ones who don't play politics, just solve problems. When I spot them, I make sure they're heard. It's the one thing I needed most, and the one thing I now have the power to give. So no, I don't need my dad's approval anymore. But I think he finally sees me, not as the version he imagined or feared or tried to fix, just as the person I've become. And honestly, that's enough. If you've ever had to earn respect from the very people who once dismissed you, you know how complicated that victory can feel. Would you have taken the board seat if it meant overseeing someone who never believed in you? Have you ever proven someone wrong just by staying the course? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. And if this story hit home, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder. Being underestimated doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means they haven't caught up yet.